Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Centre for Cities event. The event is one of our City Horizons series, which asks important speakers to talk to us about important issues that are impacting national and local economies and the role of cities in all of this. Today's event fits that bill perfectly. We have a very, very important speaker, none other than the Chief Economist at the Bank of England and the Chairman of the Industrial Strategy Council, Andy Haldane. And we have important issues to discuss: productivity, prosperity, inequality, the pandemic, and obviously the role of cities and industrial strategy in addressing these kind of issues. So before we begin, as always, the event is being recorded and it will be made available on our website along with the slides that Andy's going to use after the event. During the event, we recommend you select speaker view, and please keep your microphones on mute unless you're called to ask a question. If you want to tweet, the hashtag is City Horizons. Please do that. Now, Andy will speak to us for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. You can submit your questions at any time. You don't have to wait until Andy has finished, and you can do this by sending your question via the chat function to ask a question, and we'll be finished around 1:15. So without further ado, Andy, thanks very much for being with us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that kind introduction. I'm going to attempt to share some slides, so bear with me for 1 second. Can you see those, Andrew? Are those visible to everyone?
Yes. If you can turn your your video back on.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. 1 second.
If you're having trouble with that, Andy, I wouldn't worry. We can hear you, and we can.
I think is that working?
See this? Yeah, we go. That's perfect.
Lovely.
And you're on slide 2. If you you might want to.
I will go back one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Sorry to be for that. Hope you can see me, and much more importantly, see the slides, because they're the key bit. And thank you, Andrew, for that. Let me just start by congratulating the Centre for Cities for all their work on all these issues. Doing levelling up before it was trendy, indeed before it was a word. It's been really valuable over many years to have that work done. I congratulate you on it. Indeed, I will mention some of that work as I go through these slides today. This is all on Zoom. Yesterday I gave a speech and was Zoom bombed for the first. I didn't even know what Zoom bombing was until yesterday, and it happened to me. So I'm hoping to avoid a repetition today, Andrew. I also learned a new word yesterday at that speech, which was side hustle. And I'm here speaking in my side hustle job, which is as chair of the Industrial Strategy Council, rather than as chief economist at the bank. So I'm going to avoid any questions about monetary policy. So not much point in asking them, actually, because I'll seek to avoid them if possible and focus on the crucial issues here around levelling up, the impact of COVID and what that might mean for cities, indeed for spatial issues generally. So let me give you a kind of rough running order. I thought I'd say a word about where we're coming from on all matters levelling up. This will probably be familiar to many of you, if not all of you on this call, but is nonetheless, I think, important framing when it comes to where we are and where we might be going. And those indeed will be the second and the third sections, obviously a bit more speculative when it comes to looking into the future, but I'll offer you some of my thoughts on where we might be headed, and most importantly of all, what policy might be needed to achieve this ambitious goal of levelling up the country, to which the government is rightly fully committed. Let me start though on where we were, if you like, pre-COVID on all matters leveling up. And I mean, this picture, which will be familiar to many of you, just looks at income per head across the UK regions. The only slightly novel bit is that I've drawn this as a cartogram. I've scaled the regions according to the scale of their income per head, which is why it looks a bit distorted, with a swollen south and a slightly shrunken north, to put it in fairly stylized terms. Those regional differences, as we all know on this call, are pretty chunky. Between the richest and the poorest, something like a 40 or 50% difference in income per head. The self-same would be true if we looked at metrics such as wealth or productivity, or indeed health outcomes pre-COVID across the country. Are those differences big? Are they a cause for concern? Well, I think there are good reasons for thinking that they are, hence the levelling up agenda. Here's one window on that world. It just looks at how the distribution of, again, income per head across UK regions has evolved over the last 20 years or so, and the sort of turquoisey distribution, or the blue one, if you like, is the most recent. It's the flattest and widest, suggesting that over that 20-year period, we've seen a widening of the gap between the richest and the poorest UK regions. And in fact, you can look at that over a much longer time span to provide a bit more historical context. And that's what this chart does. It looks at the distribution of income across regions right back to the start of the 20th century. And the key takeaway there is that the pickup we've seen in spatial inequality at the regional level over the last 20 years has taken it back to a level that's as high or higher than it was back at the start of the 20th century. I've seen this chart going back a bit further, actually, and the levels currently are still a bit lower than they were in the middle sort of 1850s time, but nonetheless still very high by any recent historical standard. What is true in the time series, if you like, is also true in the cross section. If we look across countries, so the left-hand side picture here just compares the regional distribution of income in the UK, France, and Germany. And on that basis, the UK plainly has a much wider distribution than those two other European neighbours. And if we look across the spectrum of EU countries, this is the right-hand side picture, the UK still ranks pretty high when it comes to regional spatial inequalities by comparison with, I think, everywhere apart from Romania and Poland on this chart. Now, I mentioned that picture, the pictures I've just shown you were true certainly of income per head, of productivity, of wealth, and of health. Interestingly, if you turn from wealth and health to happiness, and that's what this picture shows, it shows a somewhat different pattern of spatial difference. So darker colors here mean happier, and you'll see from that Northern Ireland stands out as being by some margin the happiest place in the UK, despite being in relative terms somewhat less well off. And London stands out at the other end, despite being the richest by some margin, as also the most miserable by some margin. This chart certainly kind of echoes my own anecdotal evidence on the London commute. And I'll come back to that happiness point a bit later on in the presentation. Now, so far I've focused on regional differences. What's also true to say, though, if you delve within regions, is what you typically find is that differences within region are every bit as large, if not larger, than differences between region. And that's what this picture speaks to. Again, it looks at income per head. It's a slightly odd picture, this so-called kind of violin chart. It sort of maps the distribution of income per head. In the first, the picture on the furthest to the left, as you see it, just looks at the sort of nuts one, the regional level distribution. And then the pictures moving to the right, where the purple is added, what they are doing is looking at those differences at a higher level of resolution, a higher level of granularity within region level, nuts 2 and nuts 3 for those who like this sort of thing. And the key takeaway from this picture, again, probably one familiar to many of you, is that within regional differences are at least as large, if not larger, than between regional differences. The way I've described this elsewhere is it's a bit of a sort of fractal-like pattern, which is to say you get the sort of same pattern, same distributions, sort of self-replicating, whatever the level of resolution at which you view them, a bit like a coastline, really. And that fractal pattern, I think, is a pretty good description, pretty accurate description of what we see across UK PLC. Not only is the economy local, it's very local and perhaps even increasingly local when you look at those spatial patterns. This chart makes the self-same point, looking specifically at 4 cities, Belfast, Cardiff, Edinburgh, and inner London. This looks at health outcomes. If I were to plot, I don't know, incomes or indices of deprivation, you get a similar sort of pattern. It's a very variegated pattern. And you often have, even within cities, as many of you know, sitting cheek by jowl, areas doing very well and areas doing very poorly. This underscoring, if you like, the very local nature of the spatial differences we see right across the UK, both within cities and within regions. This final picture, which actually different forms of this picture have been used by the Centre for Cities themselves in their excellent research. It plots a measure of population looking horizontally against a measure of GDP per head looking vertically for a selection of UK cities highlighted here, and a whole selection of international cities. There is a line of best fit drawn on that. It's a pretty sketchy line of best fit, but there's a line of best fit nonetheless. And the key point is that points upwards, which is to say the larger the population of a city, generally speaking, the higher its income per head, and indeed the higher its productivity. This is sort of economies of scale or economies of scope point as it applies at the spatial level. It's reasonably well established as a spatial stylized fact. And the key takeaway from this, and the one the Centre for Cities work has underscored, is just how many of the UK cities sit below that line of best fit. You know, a great many of our second and third tier cities sit below that line, including, you probably see on here, Glasgow, Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, Cardiff, etc., etc. My fellow a Sunderland supporter, Paul Swinney, from the Centre for Cities, has done excellent work just looking at this phenomenon and pointing out how much money is on the table if some of the cities I've just mentioned could be pushed up towards that line of best fit. We're talking tens of billions of pounds of potential there if there was levelling up towards those cities' true potential. I should say fellow Sunderland supporting, actually fellow Sunderland suffering, I should really say, when it comes to me and Paul and our choice of football club. Anyway, that's where we were, if you like, coming into the COVID crisis on a whole range of issues around spatial differences across the UK, large and widening with some clear outliers. Let me turn then to the question of what has changed during the course of this year. How has the COVID crisis affected all matters levelling up? Well, I think that the short answer, or my short answer to that question, is in a rather complex and nuanced way. Certainly, I think it's not true to say that COVID per se has made a whole load worse levelling up for a whole load of areas. I think the picture is much more nuanced than that. That is true of some areas, but by no means of all areas. Let me elaborate on that a bit. If you think about what COVID has done, the sort of behavioral change that it has affected, and of course that's been a very significant, a very fundamental set of behavioral changes. Let me mention just two or three of those. Plainly, it is fundamentally reshaped for a great many people, perhaps as many as half the workforce, the way in which we work. So, pre-COVID, something like 5% of the workforce was regularly working from home. At its peak in March, April, around half the workforce were working from home. Currently, that's nudged down a bit, but still around a third of the workforce working from home, massively up from where we were pre-COVID. That has obviously fundamentally reshaped the fortunes of different parts of the country. What's true of how we work is true also of how we spend. Again, we have seen some pretty striking shifts in both where we spend and indeed on what we spend. On the first of those, there's been a big shift, predictable shift, towards greater amounts of online spending. That's up to around a third of all spending is now done online. And as the flip side of that, somewhat less is being done on high streets up and down the country. And it's also been true of the pattern of spending in the economy. So on the upside, sales of household goods and DIY, indeed cars and houses, have gone up quite a lot, but social consumption spending in pubs and restaurants and hospitality outlets is materially down, and that too has had a reshaping effect on different parts of the UK. And last but by no means least, kind of following from the second, really, it's clear from the evidence that different sectors of the economy have been hit in very different ways. I give a few examples here that be familiar to all of you. And of course, that has had a spatial spillover effect, given that the distribution of sectors across different parts of the country is not even or homogeneous, indeed far from it. So with those three factors and others besides having gone on in a very sizable way, that has had quite differential effects across cities, towns, and rural regions in a way that doesn't match a very simple good for levelling up, bad for levelling up narrative. For example, and I'll come on to this, it's very clear that some cities, many cities, perhaps even most cities, have been harder hit than the generality of the country. So in that sense, we've seen not so much a levelling up as a levelling down, at least during the course of this year. We've seen some of the less well-performing parts of the UK, certain towns and certain regions, also being hard hit. If you are a tourist or hospitality-centered part of the UK, then you faced in some ways a double whammy. That's not true, of course, of all of the left behind towns. Some actually, in relative terms, have really done a bit better than the country at large. So let me try and bring some of those points to life with a couple of pictures. They're both pictures I've borrowed actually for the next two from the IFS, the Institute for Physical Studies, who've done some excellent work actually looking how this interplay of pre-existing spatial differences on the one hand and the additional effects of COVID on the other have combined. And that's what this picture taken from the IFS seeks to do. It shades in different parts of the UK. So that the green bits here would be those parts of the country that pre-COVID would be classified on their classification scheme as left behind. The purpley bits are parts of the country that by dint of their sectoral composition or labour force would expect to be hardest hit by COVID effects. And the red bits marked here are regions that have faced the double whammy of both being left behind and facing COVID effects. You'll see there are a number of red zones marked here. It's by no means widespread, and indeed it's pretty spread out across different parts of the country. This is just kind of making the point really that the picture post-COVID on levelling up is not a simple one. It's a rather nuanced one. COVID assuredly has not solved the levelling up problem. It's just changed its composition somewhat. This graphic makes the same point in a somewhat more simplified fashion. So running vertically here, we have the sort of most left behind quintile of the distribution running at the north there, and the least left behind at the bottom. And then running horizontally, we have a measure of how badly affected those different parts of the country are by the COVID crisis. It's just about true to say that the most left behind parts of the UK have probably been hit a bit more by the COVID crisis. The kind of top right of this block is a bit bigger than the bottom right of this block, but nonetheless, it's by no means a super clear or unambiguously true fact based on this metric. I think what is much clearer is when we come to look at the ways in which the COVID crisis has hit our cities, and indeed cities all around the world. We knew that pre-COVID population and population density was our friend. It was a factor generating those agglomeration effects I mentioned earlier on, and the motive force, if you like, between the rise of the cities and within that, in particular, the rise of the super cities. What was an asset, in other words, population density pre-COVID, has become something of a liability in the light of COVID. And let me illustrate that with a few pictures, if I may. This is a picture that just looks at UK cities here, a range of them, and their density, their population density, is measured horizontally and measured vertically across three metrics of mobility. Is the peak to trough in different measures of mobility, whether walking to the left, driving in the middle, or transit to the right. And the key takeaway from this picture really is that the denser in population terms the city, the greater was the peak to trough contraction in various measures of mobility within that city, as a proxy, if you like, for activity within that city. Not surprising, I don't think, but nonetheless striking. And more striking still, I think, is if you look at this internationally. This again looks at a metric of mobility for, in this case, 4 countries: Italy, Russia, Spain, and the UK. I've got no idea why we picked those 4 countries other than the UK, but nonetheless, they make the point. So the colored line here shows a time series of a metric of mobility across those 4 countries. And the gray lines for each country block show the pattern of mobility for the largest cities within each of those countries. And the key takeaway here, of course, and you can read it off the chart for yourself, is that those cities, in many cases, both fell further peak to trough in terms of the level of mobility within them during the COVID crisis, and in every case have recovered more slowly as lockdown has been released. You'll see for the UK picture, there's a particular city outlier there right at the bottom where the rate of recovery has been weakest of all. And you'll be unsurprised to hear that that city in question is, of course, London, indeed central London. And let me illustrate that a little bit more with this picture. Again, it's a metric of mobility here just for the UK, and I've broken it down between the different locations in which people find themselves. So lockdown meant, of course, you're going to spend much more time at home, and that's why the residential lines here have gone up. But there's a flip side of that. You'd be spending much less time in work. That's the picture at the bottom in the middle there. Much less time traveling. That's the picture at the bottom of the left, and much less time shopping. That's the picture at the top on the right. This looks at the 50 largest cities across Europe, and they're all shown in grey. I've just highlighted within that the position for central London, yellow, and for the whole of London, that's red. And the key point here is that they sit right at the bottom of the European city pack when it comes to metrics of mobility. Now, you might ask, to be a good question. Mobility is one thing, but activity and spending is not the same thing. What do we know about the second of those? Of course, it's the second of those that matters most from an economic perspective. Well, this picture seeks to speak to that, and I've got the Centre for Cities to thank for this picture because it comes from their data, and it puts side by side a measure of mobility broken down between different UK cities. That's on the left-hand side, and a measure, an index of spending within those same cities, again ranked weakest to strongest, going south to north. And the key point here is that while not an absolutely perfect metric of spending behavior, nonetheless, that mobility data does seem to map pretty closely into metrics of spending. That is to say, the hardest hit to activity also appears to have been felt by the larger UK cities with the most densely packed populations. One of the important reasons for that, demonstrated here, again, no great surprises, is because of the reliance on public transport. Look at the sort of right-hand side picture here. It shows the incidence of commuting on public transport across different parts of the UK. The blue splashes, or the blue stars perhaps rather than splashes, are the places where public transport is most used. They are predictably focused around the largest of cities, and within those, of course, London and central London is a standout candidate. If I don't want to give a London-centric presentation, but I thought the London picture is interesting just because it's sort of a limiting case, an extreme case of the phenomenon I've been discussing. And this next picture, which is a London-focused picture, just takes 3 snapshots of mobility within London. So the far left is the situation. It looks at the extent of the fall relative to some baseline in mobility. So the extreme left picture looks at the map pre-COVID. The middle map looks at the situation at the sort of peak of lockdown, where the redder the colours, the greater the fall in mobility across different London boroughs. And the far right-hand picture looks at the situation relatively recently on the 4th of October. Plainly going from no lockdown to lockdown led to a very sharp fall in degrees of mobility across all parts of London. The picture now is somewhat more nuanced. In fact, there's now a pretty clear divide between central London, for which levels of mobility remain very low compared with their pre-COVID baseline, and the outer suburbs, which have returned, if not exactly, then closer to a position of normality. There's been something of, if you like, a kind of migration, urban to suburban, by dint of these behavioral shifts I mentioned a few moments ago. In fact, there's even some evidence, much more tentative, of activity being catalyzed or recatalyzed in some of the UK's towns, including in some of the less well-performing towns across the UK. This is one metric of that. Again, it's a borrowed chart from the CEBR. It looks at a number of, what many would say were the less well-performing towns and cities across the UK, and this evidence, although tentative, suggests that they have done relatively less poorly during the COVID crisis. You'll see on this chart my football teams, and indeed Paul's football team, here ranked 6th in this particular league table, which is 1 place higher than we currently are in EFL League One, which for the non-connoisseurs is an old money, the 3rd division. So let me go on then from past and present to where we go from here. Of course, any act of crystal ball gazing right now comes with huge caveats, so those are mine. Nonetheless, I mean, for me, the key question here is whether those behavioral shifts, those structural shifts that I mentioned earlier on in how we work, in how we study, in how we spend, in how our businesses operate, will they persist into the medium term, or will they reverse themselves? Well, I think there's pretty good evidence suggesting that a number of them will stick around on not the same scale, but they nonetheless will stick around. In other words, that COVID has led to a structural shift in the way we go about our business. For example, if you look at working patterns, if you ask people, as lots of surveys recently have, you're currently working from home. Can you see yourself working from home to somewhat greater degrees, even after the COVID crisis abated? Most people tend to say yes, that their model of working is going to shift somewhat, not from 5-0 to 0-5, but some blended mix in between, with somewhat more remote working, somewhat more home working, somewhat greater home studying, somewhat greater home spending than was the case pre-COVID. And that's probably also true in the amount of travel we do, whether domestically or internationally. And if that's all true, and if indeed physical proximity is becoming somewhat less important than it was pre-COVID, then that means those agglomeration effects I mentioned earlier on will be somewhat less powerful than they had been pre-COVID. Having said all of that, I still think it's very likely that those agglomeration effects will remain strong. We've done work on the Digital Strategy Council, quite a lot of work, research work, looking at, what are the place-based fundamentals that are the key drivers of success, and in particular city success. And of course, the Centre for Cities themselves have done loads of work on this too. Among the most important of those factors are that cities are hubs for culture, they're hubs for education, they are hubs for civic activity, they are hubs for infrastructure broadly defined. And all of those comparative strengths will still exist after the COVID crisis has abated. And that's particularly true when it comes to people and skills. We've seen a large amount of spatial sorting of skills across the UK, partly as a result of the location of our higher and further education institutions, but not just because of that. And that too, that gravitational pull of people and of skills, I think largely also will be preserved long after COVID has abated. And the final fact that I mentioned earlier on is that there still is that very considerable potential
Have we lost connection?
I've lost a connection, certainly.
Yes, it's.
Same here.
Yeah, same here.
Yes, yes.
I don't know if we should all log back in or what.
Oh, hang on. He's
Here
on
we
his way.
go.
We may well have lost connection.
I'm not sure where I cut out, but the key point I was trying to make before I was so rudely interrupted by the bank's IT systems was that those forces of agglomeration, I think, will remain strong, perhaps a little less strong than pre-COVID, but strong nonetheless. The reduced importance of physical proximity could mean that we're talking about a somewhat more elongated, somewhat more spatially distributed model of what we mean by a city region by dint of many more people being able to be part of the hub, even if they are physically located at some distance. We might get onto this a little bit more during the chat. But the other important shaping factor here, in addition to behavioral change, will be what happens to the course of policy, in particular levelling up policy, as a result, as we look ahead. And it's that I'll finish on. I'm going to touch in particular, from a potentially very long list, Andrew, on four aspects of policy that I see as being absolutely crucial. They were absolutely crucial pre-COVID, and I would say are even more important in the light of COVID in making good on this levelling up agenda. And those four areas, starting with devolution. I mean, self-evidently, we knew pre-COVID that the economy was very local. We've had a further local overlay of issues created by COVID. Those local, very local problems will, I think, of necessity require local solutions, and that speaks to the importance of the devolution agenda. We have a white paper on devolution coming down the pipe, was planned for this year. I think it's now scheduled for next year. We all look forward to that with bated breath. Of course, work done by the council, indeed by many others, over many years, I think have given us a good window on what makes for a successful devolution package and set of devolution policies. Here I'll just focus on three dimensions of that. The first two C's are capacity and capability. In our own work, it's become very clear just how patchy is the pattern of capacity and capability at the local level across the UK. I think doing something to remedy that is going to be absolutely crucial. So it's somewhat less patchy, there's somewhat greater capacity and capability if we are to make good on the levelling up agenda. And the third C, continuity of policies, I think is also important. Having seen a number of very good local industrial strategies joined up, created and joined up over the course of the last 12 to 18 months, very important that they are seen through to completion in a continuous fashion. If I can move from devolution to sectors, I think sectoral strategies, as we spoke about on the council just last week, are also crucial to this levelling up agenda. There's a natural gravitational pull when it comes to sectoral policies towards, if you like, the sort of frontier industries, the frontier sectors, the advanced manufacturings, the life sciences, the robotics, the financial services. That is understandable, because they're sectors that are pregnant with potential for future growth. Equally, when it comes to issues of levelling up, it's crucial that our focus, the focus of our sites, is not just on those frontier sectors, but is also sufficiently focused on what you might call a foundational economy. Those aren't areas that necessarily have quite as much productivity potential in future, but they are sectors that are nonetheless crucial to large parts of the country, particularly some of the poorer parts of the country, not least by dint of their size. For me, looking ahead, it's important that the sector strategy for the UK has a focus as much on the foundational as on the frontier, if the cause of levelling up is to be furthered. Last 2 points, Andrew, then I will definitely stop. The third dimension of policy I thought I'd mention is education policy. We know, everyone on this call knows just how important the HE and FE sectors are, for example, as anchor institutions within our successful cities. One, I think, important point here is, however, we don't always fully appreciate just the ways in which the HE and FE sectors are affecting different parts of the country. It isn't just by creating new cohorts of graduates, it's also the startups that are generated by those graduates, the spin-outs that are generated by those graduates, the extra jobs that are created locally as a result of those institutions. We've done some recent work mapping the contribution of the education sector across different parts of the UK. Let me show you a picture as a sort of taster of that. On the left-hand side, I've got a measure, a spatial measure of the amount of research funding given to institutions, HE and FE institutions across the UK. There's a bit of a focus here, a bit of a congregation of funding activity, R&D funding activity, for example, in the Golden Triangle between Oxford, Cambridge, and Milton Keynes. The right-hand side picture just looks at the distribution spatially of graduate startups across the UK. And the standout here actually is up there in Northumbria. It's actually Northumbria University is the HE institution that generates the largest number of graduate startups. Not one of the usual suspects by any means, and certainly not a part of the country that receives huge amounts of R&D funding. So that spatial separation, if you like, between where the funding is going and where the activity is happening is something I think that bears closer scrutiny if we are to have a strategy, as I hope we do, for HE and FE that furthers our levelling up objectives. And last, but by no means least, on the policy front, there is, of course, all matters digital. Even before COVID, there were some very striking digital divides across the UK, both in the availability of digital infrastructure and in the extent of digital skills, and even for those areas for which digital infrastructure was available, there was often questions of its affordability. One of the points that was raised with me last week in a call is this concept of data poverty, which is to say lots of people having access in principle, but not in practice, because they can't afford to get broadband or to have a functioning mobile. And what's true of infrastructure is no less true of skills. There are many millions of people, even pre-COVID across the UK, who didn't have the digital skills to do their job as effectively as they might. COVID has made that digital priority for me an absolute digital necessity, whether it comes to infrastructure or whether it comes to skills. We need a strategy there as well, and that strategy needs to be put on steroids by dint of the COVID crisis having happened. Andrew, let me conclude. We knew and we know those levelling up problems across the UK are acute. COVID has not solved those problems, but probably has reshaped them in ways that may call for a rebalancing in our policy approach. The key point there for me, and the key thing we need, is of course a strategy, a multi-pronged strategy for levelling up, not a set of piecemeal policies. That is where we have been, and it has not worked well. For the future, we need a strategy pursued at length and at scale if those levelling up differences are to be solved. I've given some hints about policy directions. I'm sure we'll have more to say about that in the Q&A. Andrew, with that, and with apologies for my interruption halfway, let me stop and take any questions that people have. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And if you can stop sharing your slides, and we'll get you on the screen. Fantastic. And if you can, there we go. Marvelous. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I was looking forward to the event and to your presentation, and at least on a personal level, you did not disappoint, which is very, very good. Loads in there, lots to think about. We're going to go to the audience. We've had loads of questions. Keep them coming in. We'll take as many as we can in a moment. I'm going to abuse my position of chair and ask you a first question. And we've had this a couple of times, and I hear this a lot sort of outside. You probably do as well, and actually touches on almost where you started, which is the sort of historical nature of the problem as we observe it in the UK. You know, at least a century long. And it's, I hear this a lot. You probably do. You know, that people go, well, you know, we've been trying to level up for, you know, 80 years or 100 years. We've had policies to do X or to do Y, to shift bits of the economy from the north, from the south to the north, etc. But we've had kind of relatively limited success because we are still, you know, unequal from the economy perspective, as you laid out. So people conclude it can't be done, right? And in a sense, this is just something we are pushing water up the hill, and we just have to accept where we are. And I wonder what your reflection is on that observation. I don't say I agree with it, but I hear this a lot. But also, in a sense, you know, you're in the Industrial Strategy Council. What gives you the confidence now that we think we know? Do we know more about how to do it than we did previously? Why are we more confident today than we maybe were in previous iterations? What are your reflections on that?
Thank you, Andrew. There's obviously a lot in that question. I'll try not to absorb all of the time answering it. I mean, I think like you, that sort of hypothesis I remotely support, and nor would history lead us to support that proposition, and nor would cross-country experience. I mean, we know from other countries' experience that these forces can be reversed. They are, and in many countries have been reversed by concerted policy action. That is why the UK is an international outlier. And of course, that's also been true in the UK in our relatively recent past. If you think back to my time series, which I won't call up for fear of breaking anything else. There was a lengthy period, particularly after the war, several decades, when those spatial differences were being narrowed over time, and a lot going on there. But yeah, policy was a big contributor. The post-war rebuilding of Britain was a big contributor to those narrowing of spatial differences. So absolutely, these things shouldn't be taken as God-given, and absolutely, they are amenable to policy intervention, as history and other countries' experience attest. Now, what gives me confidence, the second part of your question, what gives me confidence that those policies will be put in place now in a way that hasn't been true in the past? Well, there is there's the simple fact, of course, that those gaps are somewhat larger than they have been for some little while. I think it's true at a time when the overall pie is growing rapidly, how it is sliced matters somewhat less. When you find yourself, as we do find ourselves and have found ourselves for the last at least 10, 12 years, with the pie not growing quite so rapidly, then how it's divvied up then really matters. And that for me really is a large part of the explanation why we've seen issues of place and issues of what's latterly called leveling up really coming towards the very top of the policy agenda. I mean, that was true even of the previous government. It was true to an extent of the Cameron government. It was certainly true of the May government, and it's been true to a greater extent still of the Johnson government, who have made leveling up, perhaps partly for political reasons, an absolute centerpiece of their policy strategy. And we've seen some announcements so far that I would say are a down payment on that strategy. We still await, I would say, the fully fledged, all singing and dancing version of that strategy. I absolutely think that would have happened already were it not for COVID. And with the COVID crisis having come along, I think if anything that ups the ante further on that strategy. So for me now, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of quite when and quite how that strategy is put together. And the great work that you have done, that many others academically and in think tanks have done, I think over the past few years, gives us some very clear, I mean, it's not as if we don't have a playbook here of what works. We have oodles of evidence on what works. We're falling over ourselves with evidence on what works. What we need now is some action to make good on the words. So those are among the reasons I'm optimistic. I'm generally being optimistic, but on this aspect in particular, I'm very optimistic that we can do a lot better than we have done.
Excellent, very good. And obviously, being a Sunderland supporter, you have to be optimistic, I guess, because why else would you do it? But there we are. Let's move to audience questions. As I said before, we like our audience to ask the question that they've posed. So bear with me. Get ready to unmute your microphone, ask your question when I call your name. We're going to take one at a time because that works best in this environment. And then if your question is nice and short and sharp, we'll get through as many as we possibly can. And the first question is from Alan Haldane. Alan from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority actually picks up on this historical issue, I think. Alan, unmute and ask your question.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks, Andy, for a great presentation. There's lots in your analysis which we would share in Greater Manchester. And I have to say, as a sideline, I share your Northern football pain, being a Hull City supporter, also in League 3 for the first time in a long time. So yeah, we shall return. I share your optimism in general about the bounce back ability of cities. But I just wanted to press you on an answer you started to make to Andrew's question, which is, I agree with the policy agenda that you've set out. We've just gone through a long process of putting in a comprehensive spending review, which has all of those elements and calls for two things really. One is a much bigger levelling up focus to some of the big infrastructure and science decisions that government has made in the recent past, and the other is for a much greater degree of devolution. The question is, you mentioned the one exceptional period in terms of levelling up that the UK has experienced in the last century, and that's a 20 to 30 year period after the end of the Second World War. We're in a different world, and aspects of our experience are very different, but there are many similarities. What did we get so right in that period that we can begin to learn from now, do you think?
Excellent. Thank you. Andy, what did we get right after the Second World War?
Well, I probably haven't got time to do full justice to the history books. There's almost certainly others on this call who are much more the expert on the history of this than me. But let me just make 2 points. Hello, Alan, by the way, and there's obviously kind of great questions, and I mean, as you know, I've been trying to follow the Manchester experience as closely as possible. I mean, I think a crucial aspect here, what I would really like to see is I want two golden threads to run through every aspect of government policy. And those two golden threads are net zero and levelling up. And when it comes to how we think about policy, all aspects of policy, every dimension of policy, it'd be great if we could ask ourselves the question, do they contain enough of those two golden threads? And if not, why not? You know, so it's not just a sort of standard cost benefit, should we do it, should we not do it? That we lace into that, we hardwire into that these two crucial objectives for the UK, and we're not quite there yet, but I'd love that to be the case. I think that would help us, you know, come closer to replicating what we saw in that 20-30 year period after the war. Now, there are lots of reasons why that was the case, and I certainly can't do justice to all of them. But let me mention one, and it's a slightly self-serving one, so I apologize for mentioning it, which is then we did have a well-defined set of industrial strategies, industrial policies that were backed at scale and were backed for the duration, but for whom implementation took place locally rather than nationally. You know, to a much greater degree than we've seen. We saw subsequently, certainly during the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the early noughties. So, you know, if I was picking one thing that we should seek to replicate, I think it would be that. An understanding that industrial policies are not verboten, they are absolutely central. That to be central, they need to be operated at scale and for duration. And when it comes to the implementation, as distinct from the financing, that is best done locally because local problems can most effectively be tackled at a local level. Let me stop there, Andrew.
Okay, that's very good. So we've had lots of questions on the economic geography of the country, and you know, particularly some of the points you were making about the impact of COVID, remote working, you know, dispersal, etc. And then we've got, so I'm going to take a question from Mark Morin. Mark, if you're there, get ready to unmute. And then after Mark, and you've answered that one, and we've got a question that relates to that on the policy side from Marianne Sensio, and I'm going to come to Marianne after the Mark question. So Mark, Morin, are you still on the call? If you are, can you unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Andrew. Can you hear me?
I can. Perfectly.
Yeah, I've got a problem with my camera, individual incompetence, unfortunately. But as long as you can hear me,
we can hear you.
I can put the question to you.
Fire away.
And essentially, I asked the question at the beginning of Andy's presentation, and he kind of answered it moving towards the end. But I'll fire it away nevertheless. And it's essentially this: what does the pandemic say about the question of size and the agglomeration thesis moving forward? Because most urban policy has concentrated on our large metro regions, rightly or wrongly. And we've seen limited benefits and impact of that because our largest cities in the main, with the exception of London, do sit below the line of best fit in that earlier graph, while some of our smaller places, admittedly within the greater southeast, are significantly more productive. And that's without necessarily having the additional kind of devolved powers that many cities want. So does this suggest that moving forward, we're likely to see more localized growth and the need for thinking about spatial arrangements and economic integration in a different way that allows for polycentric growth? So, you know, looking at local authorities and our historical boundaries for local authorities, they don't fit with economic geographies. So can we now start to think about what is functional economically and what kind of levels of sort of spatial and economic integration we might now be serving?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. Hold your thought on that question, on the answer to that question for a second, Andy, because Marianne, are you still on the call?
Yes, I am.
Great,
yeah.
Marianne, I think your question neatly kind of links into that. So fire your question away and then I'll get Andy to do a double hit.
Yeah, it's kind of similar, really. So it was, should government continue to invest in just a few places like they have in the past with city and town deals, or improve social infrastructure and the quality of jobs across the UK? And I would just like to add that one thing you haven't mentioned in your talk, Andy, is austerity, which has greatly reduced the capacity and capability of sub-regions to deal with this, and particularly the continuity of policy. I'm based in a former Red Wall constituency, Workington, and we do have a town deal, but I don't really see other government policies doing much for places like Workington, even though I work in Manchester, so I see what's going on there, I see all the kind of effort that's been put in.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marianne. So pick the bones out of that, Andy, in terms of this nature, distributed nature of the economy. Does that suggest we need to think about how the economy functions differently, and should we be worried about that? And then this, constant question, everywhere, somewhere, how do we differentiate what different places are, the different roles that different places are playing? How do we respond through policy on that?
Great. Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Marianne. Take us into deep territory that I won't remotely be able to do full justice to. I will duck the question on austerity because, being a sort of God-fearing central banker, you lose your central banking badge if you comment on fiscal policy. So I will deliberately duck on that, Marianne, with apologies. On the other aspects touched upon by Mark and by Marianne, so I actually do think it's worth us thinking afresh in the light of what we now know about this new world, new ways of working, new ways of spending, new ways of doing business, for what that might mean for our appropriate spatial geography. I couldn't remotely provide answers to that today, but I'd be very encouraging of others to pick up the mantle on that and to think, what this new world does mean for how we think about the right, if you like, spatial unit of measurement and the appropriate institutional reach. I mean, my sort of conjecture were earlier on.
You just put yourself on mute, Andy. You just click yourself off mute. Bottom. There we go. There we are. That's it. You're back on.
I think I'm back on.
Yeah, you are.
I'm not sure when I must have voluntarily silenced myself, which is probably sometimes a very good thing. I do think rethinking that the appropriate spatial scope in the light of what we now know would be a very useful thing to do. My conjecture earlier on is that absolutely this is not going to lead to a mass exodus from our cities or city regions. That strikes me as extraordinarily unlikely. But might the appropriate, if you like, boundaries of those city regions have been extended, a sort of spreading as a result of what we've seen. That strikes me as plausible. Funnily enough, I think that could be a very good thing from a leveling up perspective. If the satellites from the center can now be more widely dispersed, I think that would be that could be a tremendously positive development, which bridges a bit to, I think, Marianne's question. I didn't touch upon. I should have. What's in all of this for some of the more left behind or rural retreats? I didn't make mention. I could have and perhaps should have made mention of the crucial role that social infrastructure, I think those are the words that you used, Marianne,
yes,
broadly define the crucial role that plays in the levelling up agenda. I mean high streets, I mean green spaces, I mean museums and theatres, I mean the whole panoply of things that make life worth living, basically. That too shows sharp spatial disparities, as we all know. Not everywhere can be a city hub, but absolutely everywhere, I think, should have good or better social infrastructure. So I think that very much for me needs to be a key part of the strategy, if not one that I emphasized today. Perhaps I should have done.
brilliant. Thank you very much. So we continue to jump around. Andy, I know you're very interested in sort of behavioral science and behavioral economics. So we've got a question from Daniel Timms. Daniel, are you still on the call? If you are, unmute and ask your question, which relates to repeated COVID waves. Daniel.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's just to ask, obviously we talked about the impact of COVID so far and how that's maybe had a structural shift, but very clearly the virus is still with us and things are likely to get worse. I just wonder whether, if there are repeated waves, might people start to see cities as fundamentally unsafe, that sort of thing? Might that start to count against agglomeration behaviours?
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. Your musings on that, Andy, in a sense that, if this becomes wave 2, wave 3, wave 4, do what sorts of short-term responses become longer-term responses and get baked in, and then where do we go from there? Good luck. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, a tricky one. I mean, I'm no epidemiologist, so far be it from me to give you any odds of second or third or whatever waves. I like everyone else, I think, lives in hope that there'll be a combination of improved therapeutics and improved vaccines will truncate that sequence of waves, hopefully sooner rather than later. Actually, some of the information on that is actually quite encouraging, I would say. So we're into some second wave. If we could avoid a third wave, that would be, I think, a fantastically important thing. It is true that there is, what economists like me would sometimes call, hysteretic effects from what we are seeing. That, if let's take an example, and again, I don't wish to be sort of London centric. Happens to the place where I work, that's all, or used to be the place that I worked. I've only been in twice in the last 6 months, it turns out. So absolutely, the supporting services and shops for the City of London are being laid low by what we've seen, and if they were to close, that will have some long-lasting hysteretic effect on activity in the city. That will have a lasting scarring effect on the businesses, the people who lose their jobs, and indeed the city itself. I absolutely. It strikes me as extremely unlikely that would somehow make cities a no-go zone, an unsafe zone. I think we'd have to see something much more extreme even than we've seen so far for that to be the case, and I hope and pray that isn't going to come to pass. So I think I have as much confidence as an economist ever can have, Andrew and Daniel, that cities will bounce back in the way that you say. History suggests, even with, we go back to the flu pandemic of 1918, that economies and towns and cities are reassuringly resilient in the face of these events. And actually, even experience so far has demonstrated for me how remarkably resilient people are, businesses are, communities are, and cities and towns are. And thank heavens for that. And that gives me lots of confidence that we won't get anywhere close to the problem that you mentioned.
No, very good. And we've had several. We're beginning to move to winding up. We've had several questions in relation to your observations again in the sort of interesting relationship between income, wealth, or health on the one hand, and the data you were sharing earlier on, and then this kind of question around happiness, which doesn't seem to be a kind of a nice, perfect fit. And we know we've heard more and more, conversation about we should be focusing on happiness. Policy should be prioritized around happiness and well-being, and worry less about GDP, etc., etc. And that was very much a question from several, but certainly from Jane, who's having problems with the mic, so asked me to make that. I mean, what's your thinking on that? I mean, how should we interpret the happiness and well-being data? I think that was one part of her question, and the second part was, how prominent should it be in relation to other aspects, whether it's employment or health or GDP, in terms of how we think about measuring future success?
Yeah, again, there's huge amounts in there, Andrew, and thank you for the questions. I mean, my own personal view is that absolutely these more subjective dimensions need to be weighed very importantly in the pot, alongside the objective ones like measures of health and measures of wealth. For me, the kind of third degree third dimension is subjective well-being and happiness, which ultimately is what it's all about, isn't it? And I put that picture up, one, because it tells us a slightly more nuanced story about the leveling up agenda. With the best will in the world, could never perfectly level up people's incomes or wealth, not perfectly, but we absolutely could do a better job of leveling up their sense of well-being, because people weigh different things in different ways. This bridges to Marianne's point, really, that it really isn't all about money. In fact, often it's not even mainly about money. It's about the environment in which you live, the community in which you live, and the identity of that community. So for me, I'd be weighing those factors equally in the pot alongside health and wealth when it comes to success metrics for the leveling up agenda, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I think a great point to finish on, not least because Andy's been struggling with a sore throat since yesterday, and speaking to us for the best part of an hour, I think has probably done not very much for his throat at all. So I really appreciate your time with us and your brilliant thoughts. And as I said after your presentation, I was really looking forward to this event, and I've taken loads away and thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to everyone who joined and participated. Thank you to all the questions. We had dozens and dozens of questions. I apologize that we couldn't remotely get through all of them, but nevertheless, thank you for that. As I said at the beginning, the recording of the event and the slides will be on our website very shortly, so you can go back and look at the slides and indeed listen again to what Andy had to say. So without final word, really, Andy, thank you very much for your time. And until the next time, everybody, take care and go well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Andy.